this peculiarity of view of the great expositionist, and then we get Nagarjuna's comeback on that. You get his consequential response to that. So if you remember that we're talking about arising, lasting, and ceasing, three characteristics of conditioned phenomena. And for these great expositionists, they are three characteristics. So firstly, they are different substance from the object that there is the sort of the main object we're talking about, which could be pot, for instance. So you have to imagine them as different substances. So they have to have, kind of each have a line around them which separates them from the actual object they're supposed to be, kind of, well, part of, really. But when everything is a different substance, that's the sort of the great expositionist kind of claim or assumption, and things get a bit difficult. So that's one of their problems. And then their other kind of peculiar take at this point is that arising, lasting, and ceasing, if you remember, are causal factors. So the arising of pot causes pot, the lasting of pot makes pot last, and the ceasing of pot makes pot cease. So they have that role. So that's kind of, the Sutrarians disagree with that completely. And I'm not sure what we should say. Lasting and ceasing, I think we can definitely say they don't. There's no reason to say that the lasting of pot causes pot to last, and the ceasing of pot causes pot to cease. It's like that's just what pot does, right? And then, but the arising of pot slightly more puzzling. Anyway, so the point that our school is coming up with, when you when the great expositionists try to explain how they think, well, it says, well, aren't you in danger of having an endless regression, or endless succession going backwards in time? If you want to have the pot arise, then you've got to have the arising pot first, because the arising pot causes pot to rise. But if that arising is a conditioned phenomenon, doesn't it have the three characteristics of arising, lasting, ceasing? So before the arising of pot can arise, then there should be another arising. So the arising which makes the arising of pot arise. So if that's a conditioned phenomenon, then don't need another one. So in that way, you'd never get pot to arise at all. So this is the endless succession thing. So well, you can say, well, all things come from an endless previous succession of causes, don't they? I mean, wasn't Hannele talking about this kind of the last time she asked something about that? Oh, there you are, Hannele, you're here. Good. Yeah. So doesn't everything have an endless succession of cause, before it can be produced then? Well, yes, if you say the universe is beginningless, but say you want to do something like you want to plant green beans or something, let's say next spring, when the weather gets suitable for planting out again. Well, you can go to the shop and you can buy some green beans, some seeds in a packet, can't you? Or you can get some out of your storehouse from what you grew last year. So they're ready for planting. So they just need to meet the water and the warmth, and then the process of the production of new green beans will be well underway. If you're, if they're okay, all being equal. So all the other causes have already happened, yeah. All the arising of green beans, the evolving of green beans from whatever they evolved from, or the perfecting of the green bean variety by the gardeners who are selling these beans in the shop. That's already happened. There's no problem about waiting for that to happen before you can have your green beans, because all those earlier causes have already happened. All you have to do is finish off by making the last few causes come about. But with the arising of pot, if you have the great expositionist view, or the arising of your bean sprout or whatever it is, it's all got to happen from now. Here's your bean sprout that you want to have happen still in the future. So In order to do that, you've got to plant your bean. But for the bean sprout to arise from the bean, before you have the bean sprout, you have to have the arising of the bean sprout. And before you can have the arising of the bean sprout, you can have to have the arising of the rising of the bean sprout. And then the arising of the rising of the rising of the bean sprout. So you have all these prior kind of arisings have got to take place. So the bean sprout could never arise. Because there's all these causes which haven't happened yet, which would have to happen before bean sprout could arise. So that's kind of the criticism that our school is making of these kind of lower schools. So all these arisings, and the lastings and the ceasings are all different substances, so they all have to have, you can't just say, well, the arising is just the same substance as the sprout, it's a different substance. So it's got to have, it's got to have somehow a different sort of nature, a different sort of a separate nature from the sprout that is supposed to be kind of connected with. And if it's the cause of that sprout, they should precede it, right? We're telling them. So you've got one cause having to precede another, and so you'd never get to where you want to get to.
Isn't it like?
Yeah. So this is the problem. And yes, Jason, what did you say? Something?
I was only going to say it's a bit like I think it's a bit like Zeno's paradox, isn't it? With the arrow, where you got to travel half a distance every time.
Possibly, yeah. This is possibly there's some paradoxes there, aren't there?
Mm.
With those whatever they call them, the ancient Greek philosophers. Yeah, there might be some parallel. I don't know well enough to say confidently. Yeah. So it seems like the great expositionists are sensitive to that criticism. So they do come up with this response, which was the, exhibited in the chicken and egg picture. It just disappeared as soon as I want it. Can you show that one, or can I show it, Jason?
Which one do you want to show? The chicken?
Egg, yeah. Yeah, you got it, man. Can you make it a bit bigger if you go to, yeah, that's it. Bring it up a bit. Yeah, I think that's about everything. Yeah, so no, you're missing a line at the bottom there, but never mind. Yeah, that's all right. I just fit it in. So as you remember then, you've got the basic phenomena pot, which is the bottom egg there. So then, what's going to cause that? Well, because you need a chicken, you need all the different factors which produce the egg. They're not the great expositionists. They're not denying you all those other, what we think of the usual causes of the egg, but they're saying this arising, this factor arising, is necessary to get all those causes, working together and kind of interacting with each other. So arising is this sort of odd extra kind of causal factor that's needed. So the arising there is that's the chicken that produces many eggs. So in this idea, so the arising of pot produces pot, but at the same time it also produces the lasting of pot and the destruction of pot. So those, you've got the three primary characteristics of arising, lasting, and ceasing. Arising, lasting, and destruction, like all conditioned phenomena have to have. So that's really the focus of our investigation here, and how if those things are inherently existent, they just don't work at all. That's the key. That's the main thing. We're destroying, any shred of credibility for the view that these things can inherently exist. But here we're not talking about that so much. We're talking about this sort of uncommon Vaibhastika view. It's not really going to inherent existence here so much, but obviously it's in the background. But if you try to say that these three factors are kind of causes of pot, and what trouble that gets into you, and this idea of the endless succession of arisings and arisings and lastings and lastings, destruction of destruction, and so on. Okay, the arising, which is the chicken in the picture, it produces all the other eggs there. So it produces all the others. So as we said, so if you've got arising or if you've got lasting, and the lasting causes the pot to last, well, what causes the lasting to last? So then you need a lasting of lasting to make the lasting last. And then you need a destruction to make the destruction, which then destroys the pot. So then each of those, if they're all conditioned phenomenals, have to have all the three characteristics, and it balloons out into sort of infinity. But they say, no, it doesn't balloon out into infinity, because we have an arising of arising, which causes the arising to arise. So the arising of arising causes the arising to arise, the primary arising, then the primary arising causes pot to arise, as we tried to explain last week. So, the chicken is causing all those eggs to arise, and the arising of arising, that causes arising to arise. But instead of there being another arising, like the arising of the arising of the arising, another row of, tertiary characteristics, they avoid that kind of problem by saying, yes, the arising of arising causes arising to arise, and the rising causes the arising of arising to arise. Yeah, so you've got those double blue arrows underneath between the chicken and the top egg there, you see. So then you've got this sort of tricky kind of a way out of the problem of endless succession by saying, if you've got two things mutually causing each other. So that's what we brought up last week, isn't it? You see, how can you have two causes each mutually causing each other at the same time? Well, the great expositionists say, well, that's possible. They say there's no objection to that. They give other examples, and we did give other examples. Like the four elements in a piece of wood, say, the earth, air, fire, and water. In a piece of wood, they're each mutually supporting each other all the time. They're each helping each other to be there. So then the piece of wood is a cooperation between these four elements. Yeah, it's a mixture of the four elements, but then they're all sort of mutually supporting each other at the same time. And a mind and a mental factor, like your main mind, observing something, and the compassion, the mental factor going along with that main mind, they can be mutually causing each other too, so they have their examples of mutual causation. But so sort of to get out of the question of an endless succession of causes being required, to get out of that one, they have to accept mutual causation. And mutual causation of two things mutually causing each other simultaneously, right? Simultaneously, each has to cause the other simultaneously, right? So when you think about that, that's quite weird, but they think that's okay. And that's, the next object of Nagarjuna's attack then. It says, okay, if you're going to get out of that by saying mutual causation, then, that's really dodgy. So we're not having that. So that brings us up to the next verse, but maybe we should just look at that that other document, Jason, the opponent's views document. Can we just look at that one?
Yeah.
That's so helpful, Jason. So I'm going over this quite quickly, but we did talk about it last week. So I go scroll down to the number 2, yeah? The next point. That's number 1. No, number 2, yeah. This is just a review of that. Maybe you've read this in the week, or if you haven't, we'll just skim through it quickly again, as I say, just it's revision really. So in number 2 there, the great expositionists avoiding the fault of endless succession in this verse, verse 4 that we've just, that's their way out of, this is their way out of, this is how they avoid the problems of, that they're accused of with arising, lasting, or ceasing. And, Buddhapalita's criticism of that So this is what follows is adapted from the treasury. So this is where this great expositionist view is presented in the Abhidharma text. I mean, Vasubandhu himself criticizes it because he criticizes it from the Sutrarian or Sautrantika point of view, but he presents it fairly, we presume, in there. He mentions 4 characteristics, but actually, since Nagarjuna has only mentioned 3 characteristics, arising, lasting, and ceasing, and doesn't mention aging, the 4th characteristic. And as I said, Buddhapalita comes up with several more characteristics that are all supposed to arise at the same time, but we won't bother about those. They were far too complicated. So in Nagarjuna's main verses, then it's just 3 characteristics: arising, lasting, and ceasing. And so I've adapted the treasury, which talks about 4, but I've just just changed the words a bit so that we only have to deal with 3. So can we just scroll up or down a bit? Yeah. So here we are. This is the quote from Vasubandhu himself, I think. So the 3 primary characteristics are as mentioned above. So that's arising, lasting, and ceasing. The 3 secondary characteristics, what makes those 3 characteristics arise then? Well, they have 3 secondary characteristics: the arising of arising, the lasting of lasting, and the destruction of destruction. So all conditioned things are conditioned by these primary characteristics. These primary characteristics in their turn are conditioned by the 3 secondary characteristics. When a dharma arises, which we will term the principal dharma or the dharma, root dharma, so that's pot, for instance. Remember in the picture, that was the bottom egg. 7 dharmas, including it, arise together. So the principal dharma is the pot, and then the 3 primary characteristics, arising, lasting, and ceasing, and then the 3 secondary characteristics, arising of arising, lasting, and ceasing of ceasing, or destruction of destruction. So then the first primary characteristic, primary arising, causes the principal dharma to arise, plus the other 2 primary characteristics, lasting and destruction, plus the 3 secondary characteristics to arise. Arising, lasting, destruction of destruction. So that's, the one chicken producing many eggs, right? In all 6 dharmas. It does not cause itself to be produced. At least they're not going that far to say something causes itself, They're not going so, they're not so kind of, as extreme as that, but it does come up later down in the text. So how does the arising itself arise, this chicken, which causes all the other things to arise? It arises through the secondary characteristic arising of arising. So the arising of arising causes only one dharma to arise, namely the primary arising. It is the same for all the other primary characteristics and their secondary characteristic. Lasting causes primary lasting to last, which in turn causes the principal dharma to last, as well as the other 2 primary characteristics, arising of destruction, and the 3 secondary characteristics, arising, lasting, destruction of destruction. Yeah, but you are left with mutual causation. Arising causes arising to arise, and arising causes arising of arising to arise. So they're like, anyway, I'm just rushing through it because we've talked about it already. Just go on a bit then. So note that mutual simultaneous production is asserted here. And just to remind you what the great expositionist views are here then, that these 3 characteristics have a causative role. So I hope you've been able to have time to read that. The Sutrarians are opposing that view, saying that all those 3 characteristics, those 3 kind of activities are just same nature as the object, which they are, connected with, which is okay in terms of lasting and ceasing. Lasting is just something that the pot does. It's not a force which makes the pot last. It's just, given the right circumstances, the pot continues. Okay, it's changing every moment, but it's still maintaining the continuum of being a pot. Yeah, so it's lasting in that sense. Not permanent, but, the moments are coming up very much like the moment preceding. So it's lasting in that sense. And so that's just something pot's doing. It's not causing pot to last. So that's okay. But, what about arising? So just looking at the bottom of what's on the page at the moment, it says, according to us, what we should understand by production or arising is the fact that the series begins. So it's like arising is like, it's just like commencement or something. It's not like an action of arising there. It's like, it's just beginning. The series of moments of pot, have a beginning. But if you say arising is an activity, and it is an activity. I mean, okay, we can talk about arising, which means commencement or beginning. Like the meeting began. We can say that, just at 6 o'clock the meeting began. So that's all right, the beginning of the meeting. But we have to deal with the fact that pot does arise. So there is an action of arising. Yeah, and when does the action of arising take place? Well, let me ask somebody now. We've got the participants here. Oh, that's no good. Can we have some pictures of people, Jason, or not? Thank you. Tom, there. So the action of arising a pot, does it precede pot or is it simultaneous with pot? Tom?
It precedes pot.
It precedes pot. So is there some relationship between the arising of pot and pot? Are they related in some way? In technical sense of being related,
Yeah, I think.
Well, I think you have to say that, as dependent arising, is like you wouldn't have pot without the action of arising of pot. And the action of arising of pot, presumes pot, doesn't it? So how would you have an action of arising pot without a pot, So there is some mutual kind of dependence there, or at least a one-way dependence or something. But if the arising of pot is prior to pot, then do you think the arising of pot is a cause of pot? Of arising of pot.
Yeah, maybe say it is. If there's no arising of pot, pot couldn't come into existence.
Say that again, the last bit.
If there was no arising of pot, there could be no pot.
Yeah, so that's one way of checking that there is a relationship. They're different, and without the pot being, without the arising of pot being there, pot could not be there. But that doesn't mean it's a causal relationship. That would be also the same nature, So pot and the arising pot, are they different nature or the same nature?
Nature.
Which?
Different nature.
Different nature. So then, that suggests that the arising pot is the cause of pot. But isn't the arising pot just something that pot does?
No, because the time of arising, pot doesn't exist.
Well, if it's something that pot does it have to be simultaneous with pot? Or after pot?
Yeah, I don't think if pot doesn't, if it's at that time it does not exist, it can't do anything. It's
So
non-existent.
Yeah, but you've just said pot arises at the time when it is non-existent. You've accepted that. So pot performs the function of arising. You accept pot performs the function of arising.
Okay, accept.
Yeah, so, I don't know if it's a cause or not, So we say, if you take this piece of ice that melts in the sun we were talking about, yeah? So the ice is melting and becoming water, right? So the sun is the cause of the melting, yeah? Sun is the cause, sun causes the ice to melt.
Yeah.
Right, isn't it? So then equally then, the sun causes the water to arise.
Accept.
Yeah, so, the sun is the cause of the arising of the water.
Accept.
But then you say the arising of the first moment of the water is the cause of the first moment of water. So that sounds a bit funny to me, you know, like the sun, that's causing the water to arise. That's causing the arising of water, but the arising of water is causing the water to arise. It's a bit weird, that. But then the arising of water is a conditioned phenomenon, so it's got to be producing something. So I was trying to think about that this evening. I don't know if anybody wants to make a comment on that, but I can't, I'm not satisfied with my understanding of that.
Geshe Graham, I mean,
Yes.
it's not really a comment, but I was just wondering, in reality, does the arising of pot cause the lasting of pot and the destruction of pot?
Well, like Thomas says, you know, you could say, the arising pot precedes pot, you know, and then, so it precedes the lasting of pot, it precedes the ceasing of pot. And without the arising of pot, there wouldn't be any lasting of pot.
Mm.
So that's strongly suggesting that they are causally related. You know, if you take the different substance, and if two things are happening at different times, and there's no overlap in their time, then you would think they are different substance. They couldn't be the same substance, so let's say. They couldn't be the same substance. Two things are the same substance, surely they have to be, to some extent, you know, overlapping in time or kind of, you know, simultaneous. They can't just be happening at completely separate times. Whereas the arising pot and the lasting pot happen in sequence. So there's nothing happening at the same time between those two. So then it says, yes, so if they're related, then what relationship do they have?
Oh, which ones?
Well, the arising pot and the lasting pot.
A causal relationship.
Yeah, you think so, but it doesn't sound right to me that the arising pot causes pot to arise. And if it doesn't cause pot to arise, why should it cause the lasting of pot to arise?
What about if you switch it to cause of pot? Does cause of pot cause the lasting of pot and the destruction of pot?
Well, yeah, we haven't got on to lasting and destruction so much, really, but yes, if they're characteristics of pot, then whatever causes pot causes them, yeah.
Hmm. I mean, if lasting of pot and the destruction of pot are the same nature, then whatever causes one causes the other too. Isn't that right?
Yes. Those two we can say they're the same nature. That the arising of pot and the lasting of pot and the ceasing of pot.
Hmm. Okay.
But the rising of pot is a bit more tricky to think about. You see. So that's how we should present it in our system. I don't know. I'm not quite sure, but definitely we're criticizing the great expositionist idea of what's going on.
But why do they talk about the arising of pot instead of the cause of pot? If there is an overlap.
Somebody's trying to identify what a conditioned phenomena is. What makes a conditioned phenomena what it is? You know, we do have some permanent phenomena. We do have some unconditioned phenomena like nirvana and uncaused space. You know, and the Vibhaskas don't have many, but they, you know, there's nirvana. There's uncaused space. What's the other one? This
Cessation.
Yeah.
Analytical cessation.
Non-analytical cessation or something. Yeah. So they have their limited number of permanent phenomena or unconditioned phenomena, but all the rest, like us, like, you know, the things we see around us in made of matter or made of consciousness, or these non-associated consciousness factors, they're all conditioned phenomena. So what makes them what they are? Well, they have three characteristics. They arise, last, and pass away, which is, you know, it seems very, very proper in analysis. You know, that's in a good analysis of what's happening. You know, this change is just the theme of the universe, isn't it? Like transformation. So whatever arises, lasts, or just sort of short time, long time, passes away. So,
But I was wondering if there is a big difference between arising of pot and cause of pot?
Yeah, well, the causes cause pot to arise, and arising is what the pot does. So
But they're different.
the pot performs the function of arising. I accept that. Thomas has a hard time to explain that.
Mm.
It is arising at a time when it doesn't exist. How can pot perform the function of arising? But how can you say pot doesn't arise? It does arise, so then it's performing the function of arising. So that's all right with me, although it's not all right if you accept inherent existence, because you know, we've got a merely imputed pot doing the arising there. You know, it's a pot that's still in the future. So anyway, so the arising, the cause of pot is what makes the pot arise. So there's the potter, the water, you know, and the turning wheel, and you know, the force being applied, and the potter doing things according to their, you know, mental will, power, and skill. So then you can have a pot.
But it
So the
sounds like,
arising of pot is an activity of, you know, coming into existence. So
then it sounds like
that
the
cause of
cause of pot exists before the arising of pot.
No. Why would I accept that? No.
Are they mutually inclusive?
Wait.
Cause of pot and the arising of pot?
No. If
No.
we say the prior arising of pot, that is a cause of pot, but that then we're talking about something, you know, like the substantial cause of pot, or the potter's hands, you know, while they're making the pot. So those are the things which are making the pot arise. You know, the potter's hands, or the potter's you know, willpower, or you know, the clay, the soft clay that's wet on the wheel. You know, that they are prior arising a pot. In a sense, they're the causes which bring pot about. But the action of arising, you know, this non-associated consciousness, the fact that we call it, you know, the action of arising. So that's non-associated consciousness fact, you see. So there's, you know, you can't say that the potter's hands are the arising of pot. They're the cause of the arising of pot, the cause of the pot, but they're not the arising of pot. So we're getting into some quite difficult territory, anyway, that's going a sidetrack. So how do we understand arising? So that was kind of just not kind of in the main text at the moment. I've just got off on that. I'm puzzling about it this afternoon. Anyway, so what we're saying about those guys is that you know, they have this answer to this criticism of endless succession, but it means that they end up positing simultaneous cause and effect, which is absolutely unacceptable to all the other schools, you know, like Nagarjuna and you know, the Sutrayans, Nagarjuna, but of course the mind only are a bit different. Yeah, the mind only, like, they don't have simultaneous causation, but they have, you know, their presentation of cause and effect gets a bit weird because everything is just sort of, you know, mind only. So there's you know, the pot is the clay that the pot arises from. Is it actually a cause of pot, or is it all just, you know, coming like it's the production of the mind, kind of, you know, the pot and the icons of the same pottage arise simultaneously from one causal seed in the mind, so that, you know, the mind only views of it. They have their own anomalies. So maybe Geshe Namdak will talk about that. Geshe Namdak is going to be talking here Saturday, Sunday on the mind only view. So you might get some clues about that from him. Anyway, so absolutely, you know, simultaneous cause effect is the kind of, you know, immediately jumped on by Nagarjuna in his verses. Says that's impossible. Why? Well, that's where we get to the verse number 5 then. So if you remember, then we have the arising, which is this sort of, you know, characteristic in the third level, and that makes the root arising arise. The root arising, which was the chicken, you know, which makes the pot arise. The egg, which is the pot. If you remember, you've got the root arising making the arising of arising, the arising making the root arising. arise. So you've got each one causing the other. So that's the subject of verse number 5 then. If your arising of arising, the root arising makes arise, how will what has not been produced by your root one produce it then? So the root arising produces the rising of arising. So the arising of arising can't come about until the root arising has produced it. But the root arising can't come into existence until the arising of arising has produced it. So each is waiting for the other to come along to produce it. So you've got the root arising and the rising of arising. The rising of arising won't arise until the root arising produces it. But the root arising won't arise until the arising of arising produces it. You know, so Nagarjuna says, come on, how can that work? You've got to have something that's not yet been produced, producing something. So how can something that hasn't been produced produce something else, something can only be productive after it's arisen. So Buddhapalita says, if the arising of arising causes the root arising to arise, how will this arising of arising of yours that has not been produced by the root arising produce a root arising? Yeah, if there's no root arising, there's no arising of arising because the root arising is supposed to produce it. So how can the arising of arising produce the root arising until the root arising has produced it? Yeah, so each is waiting for the other to produce it, and so nothing ever happens. Yeah, so if you've not been produced, you can't produce something else. So how can that something else produce you? You're just kind of at a stalemate. So, the opponent attempts some feeble response. The introduction to verse number 6. Statement here, so this is the opponent. Only the arising of arising, which has been given rise to by the root arising, produces the root arising. That which has not been produced does not. So the root arising has produced some arising of arising. So it's that arising of arising which has arisen, which produces the root arising. So verse number 6. If that produced by your root one produces that root one itself, how does the root one that was not produced by that give rise to it? So it's just the same problem. Yeah. So a little bit of the arising of arising has been produced by the root arising. Or what is it? So the arising arising which has been given rise to by the root arising. So there's a bit of arising that has been produced by the root arising. But that bit of arising that has been produced then produces the root one. Yeah. So, the root arising wasn't produced until that bit of arising produced it. So how did the root arising produce that little bit of arising first when it hadn't been produced yet? So it's just the same ridiculous problem. If that produced by your root one produces that root one itself, how does the root one that was not produced by that give rise to it? If the arising of arising which has been produced by your root arising gives rise to the root arising, how will the root arising that has not been produced by the arising of arising produce a rising of arising? Yeah, you can't have any of arising. You've got a bit of arising of arising. Well, if there is a bit of arising, it's been produced by the root arising. So the root arising is already in existence then. But no, because that bit of arising which gets produced first, then produces the root arising. But in order that bit of arising which was produced first to be produced, the root arising had to produce it. But the root arising didn't arise until the arising of arising, and so on. So you just get completely nowhere, basically. Thus the two depend upon one another. And those that depend upon one another are not suitable to be investigated. I'm not quite sure what that means. Not suitable to be investigated. And another kind of person who's commenting on the text, some Japanese professor, he says, they're not suitable to be investigated as possessing separate entities, or so they're the same entity or something. But how that suggestion quite helps, I'm not sure. So the opponent's in a mess. So he says in the introduction to verse number 7, Only the root arising that is arising gives rise to the rising of arising. The one that has not been produced does not. So maybe it's a root arising that's in the process of arising that gives rise to the arising of arising. Is that the idea? So the root of the root arising that's not yet been produced, that doesn't produce the arising of arising. I don't know. So it's not very kind of, it's not much of a sharp response. Well, this that is arising would, as you would wish, give rise to that, if this that has not been produced were able to give rise to it. So if you want to have something which is still in the process of arising, giving rise to something else, then that's very suspicious for a start, you know. If you say the arising of arising produces the root arising, but if the arising of arising is still in the process of production, how will it produce the root arising when the arising of arising hasn't arisen yet? And it's the same the other way around, you know. If the root arising, which is in the process of production, produces something, produces the arising of arising, then that's very weird, you know. That's like it's kind of, you know, performing its function before it's even arisen. So you just kind of got no leg to stand on. This root arising that is arising would, as you would wish, give rise to that arising of arising, if that which had not been produced itself were able to give rise to something else. Yeah. So you'd have to have a situation where something hasn't been produced, was able to, you know, perform its function of, you know, producing such and such an effect. So that's kind of, you know, very suspicious. Well, this arising of arising that is arising would, as you would wish, give rise to the root arising, if that which had not been produced itself were able to give rise to something else. It cannot be. Yeah. So if you're trying to explain it, then something hasn't been produced, has to produce its effect, you know, produce this other thing that we're all waiting for. So it cannot do it. It cannot perform its function of producing that until it itself exists. You know, the seed cannot produce a sprout until the seed exists. Only then can it produce a sprout. It's like that. It cannot be. Thus, how will that which has not been produced itself produce something else, being non-existent? Therefore, this is fiction merely. So that's dismissed. That's no patience with that view. But that's not the end of these guys. Of course, they're always, you know, willing to come back and have a, you know, they never give up. They've always got, you know, a kind of some answer to give. But any questions so far? Okay, Hanneli.
Well, actually, I have a question. So, like something that is a cause of pot, let's say clay.
Yes.
So you are saying that clay, which is a cause of pot, cannot produce an effect of pot because it's still in the process of producing pot.
Now he's saying the clay, if the clay itself hasn't been produced, how could it produce pot?
But
the clay
the
could only
clay
produce
which
pot
is
when the
in the
clay
process
exists.
of producing pot, that clay, which is, you know, taking shape, that clay, which is producing pot, can it produce an effect of pot? When pot hasn't been produced yet.
The pot would be the direct effect, and then some later effect would be the indirect effect.
So clay, which is a cause of pot, can produce an effect of pot, even though pot itself hasn't been produced yet.
Ah, we're not saying when. When would it produce? It would only produce the indirect effect would only arise after the direct effect. But are the indirect and direct effects both being produced at the same time?
Are they?
Or should we say that the first of all the direct effect is produced, and only then is the indirect effect produced?
I have no idea.
But if you say the pot is the cause of the you know, sorry, clay is the cause of the pot and of the subsequent arising of pot, the indirect effect. And it's the clay that is producing both of those, isn't it? So when does clay produce its effects? While clay is in existence. So once clay has gone out of existence and the pot has arisen, then the clay won't be producing anything. So if they say the clay is the cause of the subsequent arising of pot, it has to be causing the subsequent arising of the pot in its own time. So it would be producing the pot and the subsequent arising of pot at the same time, simultaneously. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay, well, we'll leave it there. But I'm sure there'll be some debates on that. And what was that other question you had the other week, Hannah-Lee? It was like, well, how many points between subtle impermanence and gross impermanence? So I thought about that one, and in consultation with various eminent scholars on the subject, I decided that they were contradictory. You didn't think that then? You had another opinion.
Yeah, I thought there would be like 3 points.
Well, that's fair enough. I mean, that's not I didn't say I found that in a great text where, it's a final decision by some authority. I was consulting person discussing. So I didn't say I could
But
easily
there
be.
is a moment of pot
Yeah.
when there is no subtle impermanence going on.
Pardon?
Then it it means that there will be a moment of pot when there is no subtle impermanence at all.
Except?
I thought it wasn't possible for a functioning thing.
Well, you want me to posit my example?
Yes.
So it's an example of a pot which isn't a moment of pot which is not impermanent in a subtle sense. It's not subtly impermanent.
And what moment is that?
The last moment.
So it's not changing at the last moment.
It is changing, but the change is obvious to simple sense consciousness. It doesn't need a reason. You do, the pot's breaking. The pot's falling on the floor, it's smashing. So that last mode of pot is like the pot's just going to break now. The hammer's coming down on the pot. Bang, So it's not like heavy reasoning.
But I mean,
So
just because you can see the
correct.
gross impermanence of pot, it doesn't mean you can see the subtle impermanence of pot, which could be there at the same time.
Well, what's the difference between subtle and gross impermanence? One is that it's realizable by ordinary persons, just sense consciousness, or without you needing heavy reasoning, without needing reason. Just like when you watch a pot smash, or the last smoke of the bottle lamp go out. And the subtle impermanence that's impermanence which cannot be observed by the person's sense consciousnesses, and has to be accessed in dependence upon a correct sign and an inference. So that's to make them contradictory to me. The object which is subtly impermanent, the object which is grossly impermanent, So something which is both grossly impermanent and subtly impermanent at the same time doesn't need to be posited because they're contradictory.
They are one nature though. Subtle impermanence and gross impermanence. You can see mutually exclusive if it's explained like that. I think that's almost acceptable. They've got to be one nature. Well, no, wait.
Well, you say, well, pot itself, isn't that something which is both? there is something which has got, has the nature of being subtly impermanent and grossly impermanent or something. But then, you can try to put that forward, but it seems like it's the last moment of pot or something like that. But that's the moment of the pot when pot's getting scratched or damaged or something, Then those moments then it's gross impermanence, because you can see it happening and it's very obvious that the pot's changing. And then you've got the other moments when pot's just sitting on the table and nothing's happening to it, and it just looks like the same from one moment to another. So those moments are, in the category of subtly impermanent. So the pot as a whole, some bits of it are gross and some bits of it are subtle in terms of impermanence. So you can only divide pot up and say, well, some bits are gross, some bits are subtle.
Yeah, but if a pot's appearing, it follows pot's parts are appearing.
To your eye consciousness, like sort of thing, you mean?
Yeah.
Yes, except to your eye consciousness.
But it follows then if impermanence is appearing, subtle impermanence is appearing.
Does that follow from the parts and the whole bit? No.
It follows because subtle impermanence is parts of gross impermanence.
Yeah, but if you say the parts of the pot are appearing, it doesn't mean all the parts are appearing. I mean, the parts of my computer are appearing to me now, but it doesn't mean they're all appearing. Some of them are appearing. So the gross ones, or the ones that are near to me, or the ones that are not hidden behind lumps of plastic. So like when pot's moments are appearing, it doesn't mean every moment has to appear, does it?
But how can subtle impermanence not be appearing to eye consciousness all the time? It's just that we're grasping at it to be permanent, so we don't see it.
Okay, well, it's appearing then. It's appearing, but it's not realized. That's what they say. It does appear, but you just don't get it.
Yeah.
It does appear because it's in the subtle, it's in the substantial, whatever it is, collection of pot. So the subtle impermanence does appear to your eye consciousness. They say that, but your eye consciousness doesn't notice it. It doesn't pick up on it, but it does appear. Yeah, they say that to the eye consciousness. But that's the time when the pot's just sitting on the table and it's just not moving, it's not changing. So the eye consciousness, the subtle appearance is appearing, but you don't realize it. That's the point. So you need to realize, to prove to yourself, to ascertain for yourself, to know for yourself that pot is changing momentarily, even though it doesn't look like it. Then you have to have this. That's when you need the reasoning. But when the pot's falling off the table and it's just, hitting the floor and, it's breaking into pieces, and everybody can see that. Yeah, but so the subtle appearance is appearing to your eye consciousness, but your eye consciousness doesn't get it. That's why it needs the reasoning. Till you're a yogi who's got a super refined perceptual apparatus or something. Yeah, but that's just my thought. It's like, how it seems to me, the way they're described, they must be contradictory. So, but these things are tricky. Like, and this arising one is endless nightmare. Like, arising is kind of it's through the conditioned phenomena, but how it fits, I don't know. Yes, Tim.
I'm a bit confused by all that. It sounded a bit like you're saying that something was no longer aging without its subtle impermanence when you could see it change, a gross impermanence.
Well, it's the difference in the subtle and the gross is that either you can tell this happening with your ordinary sense consciousness, or you can't. But it's still happening. The impermanence is still happening, but either you can notice it with your sense consciousness as an ordinary person, not as a Buddha, with the ordinary person's sense consciousness.
I can see a pot breaking and it's gross impermanence there, but as the pot is breaking, it's still undergoing the aging process. A subtle impermanence must be there as well.
Well, you mean the subtle impermanence of the bits or something that don't actually break? They're just the whole bits that bit you don't see any impermanence because that bit remains as a bit.
Well, I think you'd have to say as long as the pot exists, subtle impermanence must be there until the point where you say at that point there's no pot. At that point you could say it's subtle impermanence doesn't exist. But before you can say that, but before the pot ceases to exist, even the last moment, the subtly aging process must be going there, and it was going on until it must only cease when the pot ceases.
I think I see your point, but you know, subtle and gross impermanence are posited from the point of view of the observer, you know, who is an ordinary person with ordinary sense consciousness. So it's not describing, you know, just what's happening to the pot. It's like whether that can be registered by the ordinary person's sense consciousness.
Well, the subtle impermanence, obviously, yeah, we can't see whether it's there or not. We don't have the ability to see it at any point, really.
Yeah, but when the pot's being broken, or you know, you've got a piece of paper that's going up in flames, you go, oh yes, the paper's impermanent. You don't need a reasoning to say that the paper's ceasing. It's like, you know, being consumed by the flames. So it's like,
so on the gross level, so you can see that the gross level is there, but it doesn't mean that the subtle isn't there at the same time.
well, I see your point, yeah, but is that how it is? Because, you know, like the subtle impermanence says that's the impermanence that's on the object when it's maintaining its continuum of similar type, right? So it's not, there's no radical thing happening to it, but it's changing all the time, but it's just maintaining its sort of, you know, present appearance. And the gross impermanence is when the continuum of similar type comes to an end. You know, so that's when the pot breaks, or the soap bubble bursts, or the flame goes out.
At that point, you can't talk about the impermanence of pot, because pot no longer exists, or bubble or anything. It's all
the last moment of pot, the last moment of butter lamp, the last moment of the soap bubble.
Isn't last moment also an instance of subtle impermanence? We don't realize the exact moment, you know, when the pot breaks.
Well, if the pot's, you know, somebody's dropped the pot out of the window, it's like going to hit the ground. So it's not hard to see that, you know, the tree started to fall down, like, you know.
Yeah, but I don't realize the exact moment. I get you know, quite a messy, you know, perception of it's happening, but I don't realize the exact moment that it's breaking up. That's you know, a subtle instance, no?
You have to discuss it, you know. Yeah. So thinking about that one, yeah. Yes. Okay. So that's just my conclusion, that they are contradictory. But you seem to be like resisting that. You say that it's subtle impermanence all the way through its continuum, and then it's, even while it's undergoing gross impermanence, it's still subtly impermanent. Maybe the only person who can answer that is Anila herself. Maybe we should go on a bit. I don't know.
Can I just quickly say one last thing on that?
Yeah.
The definite. So you said, okay, I'm looking at my computer, but it doesn't mean I have to see all my parts. Fine, but the definition of one nature is if they could appear, they would not appear separately. If they could appear to direct perception, they would not appear separately. So that would mean then that subtle impermanence and gross impermanence, well, we don't need subtle impermanence to appear all the time for it to be one nature with gross impermanence.
Yeah, to the direct perceiver to which they both appear, they do not appear separately or indifferently.
Yeah. So that would make, in my head anyway, gross impermanence and subtle impermanence one nature.
Well, it stops being subtly impermanent, then becomes grossly impermanent. Like the seed stops being a seed and becomes a sprout. So they you know, one is first and then the other. So they're like that. I'm not sure you should say they're the same nature when they don't exist simultaneously. But some people say they do exist simultaneously. So, but I'm saying they don't. I'm saying it stops being subtly impermanent and becomes grossly impermanent. But Tim seems to think that's not the case. It's subtly impermanent all the way through to the end, the bitter end.
Well, it has to be because
at the same time.
yeah,
But yeah,
but it has to be.
gross and subtle at the same time. You know, I mean,
That's like you can't say that it's like a sprout that appears into something else, because that's almost like saying there's two natures, two things going on. But
the seed and then the sprout, two natures, the seed and the sprout. You know, the second to the last mode of pot and the last mode of pot, they do different natures. The cause and effect are always different nature.
okay, like that, yeah. But ultimately, the last moment of the pot is also like 1,000 flickering light, candle lights, isn't it? There's 1,000 million of them going off in micro nanoseconds just before it goes out. Still, you just can't have it without it, because this chunk of pot that's breaking apart is still just 1,000 billion moments. Anyway, doesn't matter.
Sounds like you've been on one of those Goenka courses again, Jason. Like Yoris.
Because Ishira was about to ask something like, we cannot speak about gross impermanence for instance, the space in the cup. When the cup disappears, the space inside ceases to exist. Yeah, we cannot speak about gross impermanence in this case.
Of the uncaused space, you mean?
Yes.
That's the permanent phenomenon. Yeah.
Yes, permanence.
So it comes to an end.
Yeah.
So it has a continuum. I mean, it goes out of existence. Let's say.
Yeah. So it has to be, if it's gross impermanence, it has to apply to a functioning thing, which has to be subtly impermanent. Like has to be, as a kechima, has to change. So even the last moment of the pot has to change, and even if it's gross impermanent.
I'm not denying that.
Yeah.
That's why the pot does change. It changes into lots of broken bits.
Yeah.
But anybody can see that.
Mm.
Doesn't there reasoning, does it?
Yeah.
But yeah, it's okay. It's there's a lot to think about there. You know, it's not. Yes, it's yes. There's a lot to think about. Definitely. What does it mean to be a conditioned thing? And to come to the conclusion that the only way they can exist is by mere imputation, mere appearance in the perspective of the consciousness apprehending them, you know. So that's the conclusion you're supposed to end up at, which is, you know, the most bizarre alternative of all, but that's the one that makes the most logical sense, apparently. You know, that it has no self, it has no nature of its own, it's just, so it has no nature from its own side. The only nature it can have is that which is, you know, conventionally, like, you know, kind of ascribed to it by consciousness in to do sort of kind of coming up with the idea of a pot, you know. So it's all very mysterious, yeah. Anyway, let's just for the last few minutes go on to the next section. So the opponent hasn't given up with his idea of arising being a sort of a causal power in his own way, you know, sort of separate substance and everything. But now he's taking a very bold move, and he's kind of saying, well, arising just gives rise to itself, you know. He's trying to cut out all the difficulties of arising, giving a rise to root arising, giving arising to arising of arising, and all those problems. He's saying, well, arising just gives rise to itself, okay. So I don't know if this is a view of any actual school. We know that the great expositionists were talking in the way that in the last few verses, because that's in the treasury, you know, and that's Vasubandhu giving the mainstream great expositionist view. But this one, okay, well, arising just gives rise to itself then. I'm not sure if that's the view of an actual Buddhist school or just some guy coming in, just you know, to sort of keeping the argument going in Buddhapalita's text or what. So anyway, this opponent, even if no other arising gives rise to it, still arising gives rise to its own and others' entities. So the arising still gives rise to the pot, but what produces the arising? Well, arising just gives rise to itself. You know, so you've got self-creation here now, which is another really, you know, it's the last sort of thing you should be accepting in terms of, you know, so something just gives rise to itself. Something just produces itself. Well, how could that possibly be? Anyway, that's what he's saying. It gives rise to its own and others' entities. And he's got a great example. The lamp and the illumination, the lamp and its light. So how? And he gives his example, verse number 8. Just as a lamp illuminates its own and other entities, arising too may make arise both own and others' entities. So just as a lamp illuminates itself and illuminates other phenomena, so arising, you know, makes itself arise and makes other things arise. What's the problem? And some guys have been studying the basic program, and this at the time they're on chapter 9 of Shantideva. That's the present subject here in Nalanda, and this illustration of the lamp and its illumination comes up there too. Have you got that far yet?
Yeah, and the self-cognition.
So it's a different. Well, it's not so different, you know. They're saying that in there, you know, the mind only and other schools believe, and the Sutrarians. But I think it's in the context of mind only, isn't it, that it comes up. But they're not the only school who believe in these self-cognizers. So every time you have an awareness seeing blue, say, let's say an eye conscious seeing blue, as sort of, you know, part and parcel of that kind of, you know, process of awareness, that process of knowing something such as blue, the external phenomena, there is also at the same time, the mind is somehow, there's a kind of a self-cognizing factor there too, so that the mind or some other part of the mind or whatever it is sees the mind which is seeing blue. So each mode of mind is self-illuminating in the sense that not only does it see, for instance, the external object like blue, which it is, you know, mainly kind of focused on, but at the same time, there is this sort of self-cognizing factor which sees the mind itself seeing blue. So, you know, that's something, again, the Prasangikas and Tsongkhapa, they all reject that, you know, that's ridiculous, you know, they sort of hate it. As kind of, you know, that's just an excuse to believe in inherent existence type of thing, you know. The person who believes in those, they're just, you know, they're just kind of, you know, it's just an excuse to say things inherently exist. So what the connection is, you know, maybe a bit subtle, but it's sort of strictly rejected by the consequentialists, this idea of a mind being able to know itself. You wouldn't think that's so ridiculous, I don't, but you know, it's quite clearly like they're strictly against it. But here it's not kind of quite in the it's not quite the same argument. We're not talking about whether a mind knows itself. We're not talking about whether a knife can cut itself. We're not talking about whether a finger can touch itself. We're talking about you know, whether arising can give rise to itself. But there's the same example. Just as a lamp illuminates itself, so arising can give rise to itself, and then the arising gives rise to other things too, just as the lamp illuminates other things as well as itself. So it's interesting that the same example should come up in these different contexts. So Buddhapalita says, just as a lamp not only illuminates itself, but also illuminates other things such as pots and cloth, likewise, arising too not only gives rise to itself, but also gives rise to other things such as pots and cloth. Yes. Okay, so far so good. Okay, so response. If a lamp could illuminate its own and others' entity, arising as you would wish, might also give rise to its own and others' entities, similar to the lamp. A lamp does not illuminate its own or others' entities. What reason? Since there is no darkness in a lamp, or in the place where it is set. Okay, so we're not going to go further than that tonight, but I'm just pointing out that not only is Nagarjuna going to sort of insist the lamp does not illuminate itself, which if you think about that, you might start to agree with that. The lamp doesn't light itself up. Yeah, and that's like a knife can't cut itself. And like a finger can't touch itself. So that kind of makes sense. You know, the part of the thing which is doing the touching cannot be that which is touched. Yeah, and if you've got a, you know, and the part of the knife which is doing the cutting cannot be that which is cut. That which is the cutter cannot be that which is cut. So doesn't that make sense? You know, that which is doing the cutting, you know, cannot be that which is cut. Yeah, so I mean, those simple examples, maybe they're the clearest one to think about. A knife, you know, that which is doing the cutting cannot be that which is cut. Yeah, and the finger, I could say, well, the finger can touch itself because you can bend it, you know, like that. But that which is doing the touching cannot be that which is touched. That's the point. That which is doing the touching cannot be the touched. So the toucher and the touched have to be, you know, distinguished. So that's the Prasanga's basic trip. You see that the agent, you know, and the agent cannot be, you know, the acted upon. Anyway, so that's kind of understandable. Does it apply to the lamp as well? Does it apply to the mind as well? Well, those examples have become a bit more, you know, difficult to, you know, picture in your mind. But then he's saying the lamp does not illuminate others' entities either. So the lamp, he's saying that the Nagarjuna says the lamp doesn't illuminate its own or others' entities. So the lamp doesn't illuminate other things either. So he's really going, you know, radical. Like just there's no arising, there's no ceasing, there's no permanence, there's no severance, there's no sameness, no difference, and there's, you know, the lamp can't even illuminate other things, never mind itself. So that's more challenging. So this is one of the more kind of tricky parts of the text, as if we haven't had enough of them already. So this is like verse 9 to verse number 12. So I found this very tricky. So I actually translated all of Tsongkhapa's commentaries on these few verses. I know they're translated in that text. What's it called? Ocean of Reasoning, is it?
Yeah.
Yeah. But I wasn't satisfied with that translation. I had to do my own. So you'll find my translation of Tsongkhapa's commentary on these few verses in one of the back notes. First, maybe it's the first of the end notes, end note number 1, I think it is. So I was trying to grapple with, you know, Tsongkhapa's, you know, sort of saying what's happening. I had to translate it all myself. You know, maybe if you look at my translation and the other translation, maybe you see. Anyway, so that we'll look at that next week. It's going to be interesting to see what is said there then. We'll have to stop there for tonight. Okay, thank you for listening.